That last one needs a little more explanation, but I'll have to do it another time, because on Tuesday I celebrate having been ordained to the ministry of the Word and Sacrament in the United Church of Christ for 30 years. And my call to ministry reminds me of the call of a young Samuel. I was 16 years old, and I kept having a series of dreams. Night after night, I saw myself in the role of a pastor, preaching and visiting the sick and so forth. Now, my whole family was so involved with church that it made sense, but I had already told God I wasn't interested. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew it wasn't that. However, the dreams kept coming and coming. It took me a lot longer than 3 nights. Coming and coming, weeks, months actually, and it became more and more annoying. So I was a youth delegate to a statewide church meeting, and I told some ministers I knew about my dreams. And if I had heard somebody say it to me, I would have said back to them as well, sounds like the call of Samuel. So when you wake up, say yes to God. I wasn't having that. And the dreams kept coming and coming until one night I woke up and with a great lack of enthusiasm said, all right, enough already. That's my call to ministry. But in reality, as soon as I said that, I literally felt washed in peace. And I knew it was right. Okay, message received. But of course, nothing is that easy, right? Enter all those years of feeling different, not knowing what that meant, and then not wanting to be different in that way. I knew the call was from God, and it was real, but how could I both be gay, which is after I finally could say the word out loud, and still be a pastor? But thanks to another very powerful dream, and it only took one, I realized that I'd have obstacles that others wouldn't, different ones, but that I had to proceed on faith. And so in the next verse, God told Samuel, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of all who hear it tingle. Now, it wasn't good news for Eli, but he said back, you know, God is God, and God will do as God pleases. And I believed that. I just had to figure out my part. So, long story short, I finished seminary, during which time I chose the UCC as my new church home. And it wasn't without its own set of problems, but it at least provided a possibility of ordination. Because back in 1972, Bill Johnson was the first openly gay man ordained in modern history in the UCC. So, in the normal course of events, I would have been ordained a few months after graduating, but nobody can be ordained in the UCC without a call, which is a call to a church or a hospital or something like that, which is the bottom line is somebody has to hire you. And that's the hard part. At the time, there were about maybe 100 open and affirming congregations, but many said, yeah, we'll welcome them, but we don't want one of them as a pastor. Open and affirming churches, mind you. Of course, you know, the same thing has been said at various times about women and of people of color and pastors with disabilities. So, back in 1972, when Bill Johnson was ordained, it wasn't to ministry in a church. 12 years later, Diane Darling went from being a seminary intern at the UCC in Modesto to associate pastor to then co-pastor, and was thus the first out lesbian called to a church. Except that everyone knew her. The question remained, well, how do you get through the search process with lesbian on your profile? Or should you? Right? I mean, why must you disclose such a thing in the first place? I remember lots of conversations with people about waiting until a search committee gets to know you before coming out to them. But that didn't go very well. Committees often felt betrayed by somebody they had come to like. And certainly don't wait to come out until after the congregation votes. That does not end well, or at least didn't. So it wasn't until 1989 that Loie Powell successfully went all the way through the process, out on her profile, honest in her interview, known to the whole congregation who voted to call her. She had only gone through 7 years of rejections from search committees first. So then, just 4 years later, I was the beneficiary of an incrementally, slowly changing world, and of those who had spent a lifetime working to change the church, with much personal heartbreak and sacrifice. When Archwood UCC in Cleveland voted to call me, we may have crossed over from fingers on a second hand to count the number of such out pastors in 5,000 churches. So it was 1992, and I was working at the UCC national headquarters in Cleveland. And I learned that a small inner-city church there was willing to consider the profiles of openly gay and lesbian candidates. They were that desperate. And that's not a joke. Archwood's 1,000 members, the oldest church in the city, had plummeted to 30 on a good day. And this was their third search committee in 3 years. Nobody was interested in them. In the first go-round, the final candidate that the committee presented was voted down because the secretary didn't like him. For one thing, he had a Jewish-sounding name. So the second candidate that they went through the process with was voted in. And then he turned them down because the secretary wouldn't let him start until she had returned from a surgery, till she had recovered. And perhaps I should have known that when a used car salesman turned them down, and I'm not kidding, my chances were either pretty good or I was pretty dumb to consider it. So I met with their third search committee, a very dejected bunch of people. And we had a wonderful first meeting together in June. And then I heard nothing from them. A couple months later, I wrote asking for notice that I was no longer being considered. And in August, I received a nice letter that said I was no longer being considered because it would cause a rift in their already small congregation. And I have to say, to be honest, I was kind of relieved. Did I really want to go to a church that was really close to being closed? However, 2 weeks later, they called me and said, would I consider getting back into their process? Okay, they wanted me. December 12th was the day I would preach, answer questions after worship, they would discuss and vote. However, the search committee worried, correctly, that some of the questions would not be appropriate. And so they appointed an 85-year-old Republican to field the questions from the congregation, because surely no one would ask him anything inappropriate. Tactic didn't work, and finally he sat down, too red-faced to continue, and just let me stand up there, and showing no shame, the undignified questions about things like my sex life continued. Occasionally, there were some questions relevant to church and ministry and vision. And then finally, I left the room while they discussed among themselves. It took forever. And I toyed with the idea of leaving. And then I heard a loud ruckus from the sanctuary, like a fight had broken out. And upon announcement of the exact 2/3 margin, someone took the microphone and spoke congratulations into it too loudly, making it sound distorted, which then prompted others to just start yelling, including the secretary who declared everyone was going to hell. And then the meeting was over, and most people just went home. I wasn't brought back into the room to say, well, welcome. And so the search committee chairperson came to get me and said, let's go downstairs for coffee. There's some people waiting to congratulate you. And so as I was standing there adding sweet and low to my coffee, the infamous secretary, Mary May Meister. Isn't that a great villain's name? You can't make that up. Mary May Meister raced toward me from the other side of the room and began screaming in my face, saying things like, we've got to keep the children away from you. Now you can just go home and have sex with anything you want. And I remember those exact words. So I was a little bit of a wreck inside, but I listened calmly, and I thanked her for her honesty, and I stepped away. And then she turned around and chose another target to berate because they hadn't made their pledge yet. I walked into the middle of the room where a lovely group of older women in their 80s held out their hands, formed a half circle around me, and said, "We are glad you're here." And I can still see the faces of Penny and Alice and Clara and Betty and Lillian. So I had hoped that Mary May's public outburst would convince the church leadership she had to go. But she ran the church, and they were used to her. How could they survive without Mary May? So I had to insist that she be retired, or I, like the used car salesman before me, would pull out too, which further angered those who opposed my call and upset even some of my supporters. They wanted me to try to work with her for 6 months. Did I mention she was the most outwardly homophobic and racist person you could imagine a church hiring? So 11 of the 13 no votes never set foot in the church ever again. I went to visit every single one of them that would listen, but it was just an hour of humiliation. One man who voted for me only stayed a few months, and he said, "I love your sermons, but I just don't see a pastor. I see a homosexual in the pulpit." And I had never once pulled out my feather boa. But to the rest of them, I grew close. They became like family to me. However, when some of them died, their family members wouldn't allow me to conduct their funeral. So, to February and to the ordination itself. The Cleveland Plain Dealer, the big city newspaper, did a big story about it the week before, which unleashed madness. Were you in Cleveland? Did you happen to see that story? For months, piles of hate mail arrived. A death threat was left on the answering machine to burn down the church with me in it. And I took the little tape to the police, who, as I figured, said they could only do something about it if indeed they had burned the church down with me in it. And I lived in the parsonage, which in this case was literally 6 feet from the church in the parking lot. Pretty clear who lived there and felt a little more than vulnerable. So we finally get to the ordination week. And in this busy week, one of the pastors in our ecumenical cluster, United Methodist Church, asked to come over and visit. Our cluster did joint services and even operated a hunger center together. And he handed me a letter that said that he and his church members would no longer attend any future event where I would be involved. He said he wanted to give me the letter in person as a friendly gesture, and added, "I hope we can still be friends." The same week, a pastor from a large suburban UCC, Avon Lake, took me to lunch The church had promised to do some work around our inner city church as a mission project. But over pie, he said the church was pulling their support. And I would have preferred a letter. Another church in our association left the UCC, citing me as the reason, or rather that our association minister had supported my ordination. In response to the newspaper story, a very prominent and very rich man in Cleveland, maybe, Pat, you even solicited donations for the orchestra from him. Well, he wrote a letter to the UCC president demanding that he intervene and stop the ordination, or he would no longer give money to his own UCC. President Paul Sherry sent him a very nice letter explaining that he would not do that, and then sent a letter of greetings to be read at my ordination, expressing regrets that he couldn't be there personally. And one more. The pastor of the nearest UCC wouldn't even speak to me or send a letter, but had someone else share the news that he would not be attending my ordination because he didn't approve. However, a few years later, I officiated at his wedding. So, things can change. So, and despite all this other stuff, I did feel very much loved and supported. The United Methodist Church, the pastor right across the street from ours, was wonderful. He organized a group to be on the watch for protesters who had promised to picket my ordination. In the end, only one protester showed up, and all he did is put little handwritten cards on all the car windshields that read, "God does not create people gay." On the day of the ordination, the 20 or so people of Archwood were dwarfed by a packed sanctuary. Many of them were complete strangers who had read the newspaper article and were hungry for a church that would welcome them. Some came back, and they laid the foundation for a church that was to come. Because nearly every one of those 20 initial people who voted to call me died within a few years. And without their radical hospitality, the church would have died too. In fact, Archwood is the only church in the neighborhood still open. The other UCC, Lutheran, Episcopal, both United Methodist churches, and even the Catholic Church have closed. Archwood still meets and worships in the same place, but wisely gave its building away to a cultural arts center that now lets them meet there for free. No rent, no repairs on this 100-year-old building. So 10 years after my ordination, I began a doctoral program, and I developed a study of others who had followed the same path, out in their profiles, honest in their interviews, and called by predominantly straight congregations. And so instead of just one in 1989 and just a handful in 1993, by 2005 there were well over 100 in my study. Despite the consistency of a great number of churches that feared losing members and money, my research proved that churches with openly LGBTQ pastors significantly outperformed the rest, particularly with families looking to raise their children in an environment of openness and acceptance. The other side of the story that I studied, however, also identified the personal and emotional toll it took on such pastors. And I can laugh now about hate mail and death threats and such indignities as being refused the opportunity to officiate at the funeral of a loved church member. But I did get worn down. Pressure by some to fail, pressure by others that I better succeed or I'd set the movement back. And I did struggle with some severe depression at times. But my challenges weren't like the pastor who was at home when someone shot a gun into the parsonage that he was in. Other hate crimes, numerous acts of vandalism. When Gene Robinson was consecrated a bishop, he had to wear a bulletproof vest. On the other hand, I can't acknowledge this first Sunday in Black History Month what churches and ministers of the gospel have faced in this country, from arsons and lynchings and daily aggressions and indignities. And in the grand scheme of things, I was extraordinarily fortunate. And that's why I'm here to express my gratitude for these 30 years and more to come, and to mark the tremendous progress that has been made. There are now 1,800 open and affirming congregations. I can't even tell you how many openly LGBTQ pastors there are, I mean hundreds. There are movements within lots of denominations, and yet the struggle for the larger church is far from over. Most churches would condemn you rather than congratulate you for being open and affirming. To us in this room, the danger is thinking it's not a big deal anymore. It is. People, straight and queer both, are still hungering for a place that would welcome them. People, queer, are being kicked out of churches, and some of our straight allies leave churches that won't welcome us. People are still being rejected around the world, and much worse. It pains me for those for whom change is still only incremental or non-existent. We still have to figure out our part and be faithful to God's call. But God is a God who continues to make a way out of no way. And blessed be the God who calls you, like Samuel, by name. I have a couple pictures to show of my ordination. Who is that young kid? And one of the songs that was sung at my ordination is called Blessed Be God, and I want to sing that today. All you have to do is repeat after me. I'll sing a line, you do respond, do it a couple times, and then I'll sing the verses. And then we come back, and I'll sing, and then you repeat after me.
Come and return to the Lord.
you.